What is up, ladies and gents? Noli here, and welcome to another Payday 2 video. Welcome also to a brand new series, Perk Decks Explained, wherein we're going to discuss how Payday 2's Perk Decks function and how to get the most out of them. The idea behind the series originally was to both inform new players of how best to select a perk deck for a build that suits their chosen playstyle, as well as to discuss the sometimes confusing wording and mechanics of perk decks to help advanced players take full advantage of it. When perk decks were first introduced into the game, I must admit I didn't foresee the need to go into great detail on how they all worked. However, a few years on from Crimefest 2014 now, and 20 perk decks in, I think there's a lot to discuss and so many details to wrap our heads around. Just a quick note for the benefit of new players, I will not be individually discussing the perks Helmet Popping, Blending In, Walking Closet, and Fast and Furious. They are shared perks throughout all of the decks, and they offer important overall or general boosts to your character. The idea was to pick up the slack from the loss of passive tier bonuses that used to exist in the previous system. This means it's seldom better to just run the first few perks in a perk deck, when you could instead be running a complete deck. So because of that, in this series we're going to take a look at single perk decks on the whole. Overall, by the way, it takes 13,700 perk points to complete a full deck, so not too many in total. Throughout the series, I will aim to discuss perk decks both in the order they were released to the public and also the order they are unlockable. Today we are going to be talking about the Crew Chief. This perk deck was designed with the Mastermind skill tree and playstyle as a distinct inspiration, and thus focuses heavily on widespread support style mechanics. The game's flavor text states, the Crew Chief, also known as the Kappa Regime, is the head of a branch of an organized crime syndicate. The Crew Chief commands a crew of soldiers and reports directly to a boss or an underboss. When the crime syndicate needs to have someone dealt with, the Crew Chief and his soldiers make sure it's done. Dallas is most likely the in-game character who is representative of the Crew Chief. Now, before we dive into the perk deck itself, it's worth noting that a lot of what the perk deck does involves crew enhancements, and these don't actually stack between multiple people running Crew Chief, so lobbies should always have a maximum of, if you're running a Crew Chief, just the one, and that can sometimes be a little bit difficult to coordinate and is something you should keep in mind. So then, the first perk we have on offer is Brute Strength. This grants you and your group 8% flat damage reduction, which has the potential to be doubled up to 16% whenever you personally fall below 50% overall health. Do keep in mind though the wording which states that only you will receive the maximum 16% damage reduction. Despite this limitation, it does have great innate synergy with the Frenzy skill, which places your health at 30% from the get-go and gives you some additional damage reduction of its own. Unfortunately, due to the way damage reduction applies for the sake of game balance, we won't simply receive 25% from Frenzy plus 16% Brute Strength direct damage reduction. Instead, and the reason we're running Wolf HUD is to show you this, it displays more like 31% total from the two buffs after diminishing returns have done their dirty work. This perk is probably the best in the perk deck, and to be honest, it's often overlooked. It can single-handedly apply the most flat reduction of damage in the game behind Frenzy when it's your only damage reducing skill, so that's well worth mentioning, and overall, being overlooked sums up the perk deck. It's constantly providing something of use, but what it provides is understandably overlooked for more focused perk decks. The second unique perk we have for discussion is Marathon Man, increasing both yours and your crew's stamina by 50%, increasing your shout distance by 25%, and reducing damage to you from enemies within medium range by 6%. So it does quite a bit. The stamina alone is a really nice boon to have, especially for lugging lighter loot and sprinting with it across long distances. Admittedly, a speed boost may have been preferred, but for the armoured style builds you will likely be running with the perk deck due to its lack of additional dodge, will be fairly well appreciated. The second part of Marathon Man is interesting. It at first sight appears to synergize with the Mastermind's Inspire skill, which, if this was the case, bearing in mind it's widely considered the best skill in the game, would be really useful. However, from testing, its 9 meter range is not improved by what is actually a rather useless boost intended to improve the crew chief's control over hostages and save him making those extra couple of steps to make someone get down. It's an odd one. Finally, the medium range damage reduction is a perk shared by a number of the perk decks, generally designed to balance survivability on decks that became unusable in the past, especially on the hardest difficulties. As such, you can see it as a little bit of a tack on, though it is still appreciated. This particular damage reduction appears to interact differently with constant flat reduction, and as such it's quite difficult to see the exact figures that it is producing in terms of DR for you. Even Wolfpack doesn't show it specifically. I'm actually going to revisit this when we actually take a look at overall combined damage reduction towards the end of this section. Wolfpack is the third perk, which follows the sort of patchwork theme of the previous perks, granting you 20% additional health and the crew 10%. Generally, the problem is if a perk deck doesn't focus on excelling at a particular facet of damage dealing or protection, it will struggle overall for the individual running it. That judgment doesn't account for how much teammates will appreciate you bringing this deck along. All I'm saying is that a little bit of extra health probably won't keep you alive when other perk decks can. The fourth perk is very similar, so I will lump it in. It is also quite subtle, the Tetsudo perk, which I believe references the Roman turtle shield wall formation, and it grants the user an additional 10% armor, and you guys guessed it, it gives your crew 5% armor. Not much to say here. Finally, we have the fifth perk, Hostage Situation, which again pays homage to its mastermind roots by involving hostage interaction. Both you and your crew gain 6% max health and 12% stamina for every hostage owned, including cops and jokered cops. Furthermore, just by having a single hostage, you and your crew gain 8% damage reduction. To quickly talk about the first part of this perk, this stacks only up to a maximum of 4 hostages, so we gain a maximum of 24% health and 48 stamina, which is, again, not bad, especially because it's not only your boon, but also your crew's boon. It's actually pretty good, but for the most part, the increase in your health is, well, especially if you're running a frenzy style build, which I mentioned had relatively good synergy with an early perk, it won't be doing an awful lot for you. And in terms of the stamina, you don't need that extra stamina. We already have 50% additional stamina we wouldn't normally have, and most builds start off with 25% additional, and so it's just unnecessary stats. Its stats spread a little bit too thinly, and that has been the problem throughout the perk deck. The second part, just moving on again and quickly talking about the damage reduction, like I said at the end of this section, Wolfpack suggests with all effects working simultaneously and with the frenzy skill running, we have roughly 42% damage reduction, which is actually pretty good, and honestly, alongside the fact that this perk deck supports your teammates, probably the best thing about it. That is of course with very specific setups, very specific situations, and you often, on the hardest difficulties, will still be going down quite quickly. That's just the problem with one down, and to a similar extent, though not as extreme, Death Wish. To test this figure, by the way, you guys will see on screen, I lobbed a grenade at my feet and I found the number that Wolfpack was giving me to be fairly accurate, even though my crew chief setup had 17 more armor due to the skill than the tag team build that I used sort of as the control to set it up. Just to come back to a point I just briefly touched on, the negative synergy with Hostage Situation and Frenzy really typifies what is wrong with this particular perk deck. Because it offers such a diverse array of skills, it's hardly a surprise that some of them clash as these two potential ones do. And that is the issue. There is a clash with skills, and none of them particularly mesh to create a distinct playstyle, and I suppose this is its blessing and its curse. You know, on the other hand, it's worth mentioning how supportive it is, and the fact that, you know, health for Hostage Situation will still go out to your crew members, so that mitigates some of the loss of worth. And also, remember that skills like Forced Friendship, Joker, and Hostage Taker in the controller tree of Mastermind do synergize quite nicely with Hostage Situation. This is how I personally suggest a build running crew chief should look. In terms of skill order, I'd say you should focus on support skills such as Inspire first, then move up to some improved survivability of your own, and then finally look for either Frenzy in Fugitive or go back to Mastermind for some more hostage skills. Do keep in mind, Hostage Taker is a good alternative to Frenzy, but don't run both. You must choose between tankiness or regeneration. For weaponry, I'd recommend strong utility options, which are generally considered meta, such as the Airbow or the China Puff. If you don't own these DLCs, I'd say running the Galant, as I do in much of this gameplay, alongside an SMG of your choice, is still an absolutely safe bet. Despite all the damage reduction you have, your playstyle should still be relatively conservative due to you being more helpful to your team for buffs rather than raw damage potential. Also, it goes without saying, be careful with the explosives around your hostages. Keeping them is the key to the amount of punishment you can take and how much survivability you have. Overall, this perk deck sets up for both an effective support and control build, as well as granting you the presence of mind that your team appreciates you, even if you can't aim. Unfortunately, it doesn't offer the best offense or defense in one category, and that is normally necessary, I would say, for 1 down difficulty, and so I would suggest it be kept to Death Wish and below. In conclusion, this perk deck is generally overshadowed by most newer perk decks in the game when they are used properly. That doesn't mean it's completely useless though. New players should consider this perk deck if only for the team boons it provides and lack of experience or playstyle required to make full use of the deck. Do keep in mind though, it excels with good communication and team play. Thanks for watching this video, ladies and gents. Let me know what you think of the format and if you enjoyed or learned anything from it. Hopefully, if you did, I'll see you all in the next one.